Someone stayed because you loved without hurting, and that sentence alone already carries more truth than 1,000 loud promises ever could. You didn't raise your voice to prove your point. You didn't use silence as a weapon. You didn't confuse love with control, attention with ownership, or care with fear. You loved in a way that felt safe. And safety is rare. People don't stay where they are constantly bracing for impact. They don't stay where every mistake is counted, where every emotion is questioned, where every vulnerability becomes a future argument. They don't stay where love feels like walking on broken glass, always careful, always bleeding. They stayed because with you they could finally exhale. You loved without making them feel small, without making them earn basic respect, without reminding them of past failures when they were already trying to stand back up. You loved without turning pain into a lesson wrapped in cruelty. And that kind of love changes people. You didn't demand perfection. You didn't expect them to be healed before being human. You didn't punish them for having bad days, messy emotions, or moments of weakness. You understood that. Love is not about fixing someone, but about standing beside them while they grow at their own pace. You listened more than you accused. You asked instead of assuming. You chose curiosity over judgment. Softness over sharpness. Patience over pressure, and in a world that often teaches people that love must hurt to be real, your gentleness felt unfamiliar. Almost unbelievable. At first, they didn't know what to do with it. They were waiting for the hidden cost, waiting for the moment when kindness would turn into manipulation, waiting for affection to be withdrawn as punishment, waiting for love to become conditional, because when someone has known pain for a long time, peace can feel suspicious. But you stayed consistent. You didn't change when they relaxed. You didn't pull away when they trusted you. You didn't become colder once they became attached. You showed them that love doesn't need to wound to be deep. That passion doesn't need to destroy to be intense. That commitment doesn't need fear to be strong. You proved that gentleness is not weakness. It's discipline. It's emotional strength. It's choosing care even when it would be easier to lash out. And slowly, something inside them softened. They stopped flinching at raised tones. They stopped over-explaining their feelings. They stopped apologizing for existing. They stopped expecting abandonment at every disagreement, because with you, conflict didn't feel like the end. It felt like a conversation. You didn't leave when things got uncomfortable. You didn't disappear when emotions became heavy. You didn't use distance to regain power. You stayed present, and presence is love in its most honest form. You didn't love loudly. You loved clearly, through actions that matched your words, through consistency that didn't fade with time, through care that didn't demand applause. You loved in the small moments, in remembering details others forgot, in checking in without being asked, in offering reassurance without making them beg for it. You made space for their emotions instead of trying to manage them, and that's why they stayed, not because you trapped them, not because they were afraid to leave, not because they felt obligated. They stayed because with you, love felt like rest. They could be themselves without performing. They could speak without rehearsing. They could feel without being shamed for it. They didn't have to prove their worth every day. They didn't have to compete for attention. They didn't have to question where they stood. They knew. And knowing where you stand with someone is one of the greatest forms of emotional security. You didn't use love as leverage. You didn't give affection only when things went your way. You didn't threaten to withdraw when you were upset. You understood. That love is not a bargaining chip. You chose emotional maturity over ego, understanding over winning, connection over control, and while others might have mistaken your softness for something ordinary. It was anything but. It takes courage to love gently in a harsh world. It takes strength to stay kind when bitterness would be easier. It takes healing to not pass your wounds on to someone else. You broke a cycle they didn't even realize they were trapped in, a cycle of loving people who hurt them, of confusing chaos with chemistry, of believing pain was the price of connection. With you, they learned that love can be calm, that it can feel steady instead of overwhelming, that it can feel supportive instead of exhausting. They learned that someone can disagree without disrespecting, that someone can be angry without being cruel, that someone can love deeply without losing themselves. You didn't make them feel replaceable. You didn't make them compete with ghosts from your past. You didn't make them question their importance. You showed up, and showing up, again and again, without causing harm, is what made the difference, because anyone can say I love you. But not everyone knows how to love without hurting. You didn't use their insecurities against them. You didn't bring up old mistakes to win arguments. You didn't twist their honesty into a weakness. You protected their heart, even when you had the power to break it. And that's why they stayed. They stayed because you made love feel like something safe to grow inside of, not something they had to survive. They stayed because you respected their boundaries instead of pushing them, because you gave them space without making them feel abandoned, because you cared without suffocating. You allowed love to breathe, and in that space, trust grew, real trust. Not the kind built on fear or dependency, but the kind built on consistency and respect. They trusted that you wouldn't disappear when things got hard. They trusted that their feelings mattered. They trusted that being honest wouldn't cost them the relationship, and trust like that is rare. You didn't promise forever in dramatic ways. You showed it in quiet ones, in staying calm during disagreements, in choosing kindness during misunderstandings. In repairing instead of running, you taught them that love doesn't need to be proven through suffering, that it can be soft and still be strong, that it can be gentle and still be deep, that it can be peaceful and still be passionate. And once someone experiences that kind of love, it changes what they will accept from anyone else. They stayed because with you, love felt human, not perfect, not flawless, but honest, intentional, and kind. They stayed because you didn't make them feel like a burden for having emotions. You didn't rush their healing. You didn't demand they be more than they were capable of being. You met them where they were. And that's the kind of love people don't forget. Even on hard days, even during misunderstandings, even when life tested the connection, they stayed because the foundation was built on care, not fear. And whether they ever say it out loud or not, part of them knows this truth deeply. You are the reason they learned that love doesn't have to hurt to be real. They stayed because every time life tried to harden them, You softened the moment instead of sharpening it. You didn't turn misunderstandings into battles. You didn't collect apologies like trophies. You didn't need to be right at the cost of the relationship. You chose repair, and repair is where real love lives. When things went wrong, you didn't ask, "How do I win?" You asked, "How do we come back to each other?" That question alone made all the difference. You understood that two people can be imperfect and still be safe together, that mistakes don't cancel love, that growth doesn't happen through humiliation. So when they stumbled, you offered a hand instead of a lecture. When they withdrew, you waited instead of chasing with pressure. When they struggled to express themselves, you listened between the lines. You didn't force them to explain their pain in perfect words. You didn't rush them to move on. You didn't treat emotions like inconveniences. You allowed feelings to exist without trying to control them, and slowly, they learned something powerful through you, that they didn't have to hide the messy parts to be loved, that vulnerability wouldn't be punished, that being honest wouldn't cost them connection. They learned that love doesn't disappear the moment you disappoint someone, because you didn't disappear. You stayed steady when things felt uncertain. You stayed kind when things felt heavy. You stayed respectful even when you were hurt, and that consistency became their anchor. You didn't mirror their wounds back to them. You didn't match pain with pain. You didn't respond to fear with abandonment. You responded with calm, and calm is healing. You became the place they didn't have to brace themselves, the place where they could rest emotionally. The place where love didn't feel like a test they were constantly failing. They stayed because you didn't weaponize your love. You didn't say, "After all I've done for you." You didn't keep score. You didn't make them feel indebted for your kindness. You gave because you cared. Not because you expected control in return, and that kind of giving feels different. It doesn't suffocate, it doesn't trap, it doesn't demand repayment in silence or obedience, it simply exists. You didn't confuse intensity with intimacy. You didn't mistake jealousy for passion. You didn't believe love had to be dramatic to be meaningful. You understood that love is shown in how safe someone feels with you, not how loudly you claim them. So you didn't compete for attention. You didn't provoke reactions. You didn't create chaos to feel wanted. You created stability. And stability doesn't always look exciting from the outside, but to someone who has known emotional storms, it feels like everything. They stayed because you didn't make them doubt themselves. You didn't gaslight their experiences. You didn't minimize their feelings. You didn't tell them they were too sensitive when they were simply being human. You validated without always agreeing. You respected without needing to fully understand. And that taught them something they may have never been taught before, that they don't need permission to feel what they feel. You didn't make them feel guilty for needing reassurance. You didn't shame them for wanting closeness. You didn't make them feel weak for caring deeply. You met their needs without mocking them, and when boundaries came up, you didn't treat them like rejection. You honored them. You understood that boundaries are not walls, they are bridges to healthier connection. You didn't push past limits to prove closeness. You didn't test how much they would tolerate. You respected where they ended and where you began. And that respect built trust, trust that allowed love to deepen naturally instead of being forced. They stayed because with you, love wasn't confusing. It didn't leave them guessing where they stood. It didn't leave them decoding mixed signals. It didn't leave them anxious about tomorrow. Your actions aligned with your words. And alignment is rare. You said what you meant. You meant what you said. You followed through, so they didn't have to read between the lines. They didn't have to overthink silence. They didn't have to question consistency. They could relax into the relationship instead of surviving it. You didn't make love a performance. You didn't require constant proving. You didn't turn connection into a competition. You allowed love to be simple, and simplicity, when it's genuine, is powerful. You didn't disappear during conflict to regain control. You didn't shut down to avoid responsibility. You didn't use distance as punishment. You stayed emotionally available, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it required humility, even when it meant admitting fault. You chose accountability over defensiveness, and accountability feels like safety to someone who has been blamed for everything in the past. They stayed because you didn't turn love into a guessing game. They knew when you were upset. They knew when you needed space. They knew when you cared. You communicated, not perfectly, but honestly. You didn't expect them to read your mind. You didn't punish them for misunderstanding. You didn't assume bad intentions. You gave clarity instead of confusion, and clarity builds peace. They stayed because with you, love felt mutual, not one-sided, not draining, not like carrying the emotional weight alone. You gave as much as you asked for. You listened as much as you spoke. You cared as deeply as you wanted to be cared for. You didn't expect them to pour endlessly into you while you stayed emotionally guarded. You showed up fully, and that made them feel chosen, not tolerated. You didn't make them feel like love was something that could be taken away at any moment. You made them feel secure enough to grow, secure enough to change, secure enough to become better, secure enough to face themselves. Because when someone feels safe, they don't have to protect themselves from the person they love. They stayed because you didn't punish honesty. When they spoke their truth, you didn't twist it. You didn't mock it. You didn't use it later to hurt them. You held their honesty gently. And that taught them that openness doesn't always lead to pain. They stayed because you didn't abandon them emotionally when things got real. You didn't check out when conversations became deep. You didn't avoid feelings by joking them away. You didn't minimize seriousness with distraction. You leaned in, and leaning in, instead of pulling away, is what builds connection that lasts. They stayed because with you, love wasn't something they had to recover from at the end of the day. It didn't leave them drained. It didn't leave them doubting themselves. It didn't leave them feeling less than. It left them feeling understood. It left them feeling calmer. It left them feeling stronger. And that's how you know love is healthy. They stayed because you didn't try to be their savior. You didn't make them dependent on you. You didn't make yourself the center of their world. You encouraged independence. You respected individuality. You supported growth even when it meant change. You loved them as a whole person, not as something to possess. And that kind of love feels freeing, not frightening. They stayed because you didn't use love to escape your own wounds. You took responsibility for your emotions. You worked on yourself instead of projecting. You healed instead of bleeding on them, and that effort mattered. Because loving someone without hurting them requires awareness, it requires restraint, it requires growth. You chose that path. And that's why, even on days when things weren't perfect, even when emotions ran high, even when life tested both of you, they stayed because over time, love with you didn't feel like something they had to survive. It felt like something they could live inside. You didn't promise a life without problems. You didn't pretend that love would erase pain. You didn't sell a fantasy. You offered something far more real. You offered emotional safety in a world that often feels sharp and unforgiving. And that's why, even when life became loud, your love remained quiet but strong. You understood that people don't need perfection, they need patience. They don't need constant excitement, they need consistency. They don't need grand speeches, they need presence. So you showed up in the ordinary moments. In tired conversations at the end of long days, in quiet support when words were hard to find, in staying when leaving would have been easier. You didn't make them feel like love was fragile, you made it feel resilient. You showed them that disagreements don't have to end in distance, that emotions don't have to end in abandonment, that honesty doesn't have to end in regret. You normalized repair. You normalized talking things through instead of tearing each other down. You normalized accountability without shame. You normalized growth without fear. And through that, you taught them a new language of love, one that doesn't shout, one that doesn't wound, one that doesn't demand suffering as proof of depth. You didn't rush them to be better. You didn't compare their healing to anyone else's. You didn't make their progress feel inadequate. You respected their timing, and timing is everything when it comes to trust. They stayed because you didn't expect them to carry your emotional weight. You handled your own triggers. You reflected instead of reacting. You chose self-awareness over projection. That alone created room for peace. You didn't turn bad days into personal attacks. You didn't assume distance meant lack of love. You didn't make every silence mean something terrible. You trusted. And trust is a form of love that speaks without words. They stayed because you didn't shrink them to keep yourself comfortable. You didn't feel threatened by their growth. You didn't compete with their dreams. You encouraged expansion. You celebrated their wins without jealousy. You supported their independence without insecurity. You stood beside them, not above them. And that equality mattered. You treated them like a partner, not a project, like a person, not a possession, like someone worthy of care, not someone lucky to be chosen. You didn't love them to fill a void, you loved them to share a life. They stayed because with you, love felt grounded. It didn't live in extremes. It didn't swing between obsession and neglect. It didn't confuse intensity with intimacy. It lived in steadiness. And steadiness, over time, becomes trust. Trust becomes safety. Safety becomes home. You became a place they didn't have to perform. They didn't have to exaggerate happiness. They didn't have to hide sadness. They didn't have to pretend strength when they were tired. They could simply be. And being allowed to simply be is one of the rarest gifts love can give. You didn't hold their past against them. You didn't punish them for what others did. You didn't make them relive old wounds. To prove loyalty, you gave them a clean emotional slate, and that allowed healing to finally begin. They stayed because your love didn't demand pieces of them in exchange. It didn't ask them to shrink their voice. It didn't ask them to abandon themselves. It didn't ask them to tolerate pain for connection. It asked only for honesty, effort, and presence. And those are things people are willing to give when they feel safe. You didn't use fear to keep them close. You didn't remind them of how easily they could be replaced. You didn't create dependency. You created choice. And they chose you, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Because with you, love felt intentional. You chose kindness even when emotions ran high. You chose respect even when you were upset. You chose understanding even when it took effort. Those choices added up. They became the reason love didn't feel exhausting anymore. They became the reason staying felt easier than leaving. They became the reason the relationship felt like a partnership instead of a battlefield. You didn't try to be unforgettable. You simply treated them well. And that's what made you unforgettable. Because in a world where so many people love carelessly, loving gently stands out. They stayed because your love didn't leave scars. It created strength. It didn't make them question their worth. It reminded them of it. It didn't make them doubt love. It restored their belief in it. And even if life changes, even if paths shift, even if time creates distance, the way you loved without hurting will remain with them. It will shape what they accept. It will raise their standards. It will remind them that love can be calm, safe, and deeply fulfilling, that it doesn't have to break you to be real. Someone stayed because you loved without hurting, and that kind of love doesn't just hold people, it heals them, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently.